can have these great efforts about what we want to do with housing in our community, but getting the word out and sort of building coalitions is really important. So with that, I'm just going to turn it right over. I think Whitney is starting. So if Whitney, you want to share your screen and get going.
Sure, thank you so much, Katie Lacey and Katie Bossy, for inviting me here. Excited to finally be having this session, long awaited. As Katie mentioned, we were hopeful to do this with you all back in April. However, I think the timing is also still just right in terms of really being able to rethink all of this in light of this particular moment. So I'm excited to be doing this alongside Courtney because I really appreciate and share in the vision of the work that coUrbanize is doing. So excited to be talking with you all today. So the idea of this talk is to really talk about the playbook for building support for community engagement. And the idea of a playbook being that, you want to win, right? And you are constantly strategizing what are the best ways to get towards that end goal, to get towards that win, right? And so we're thinking about rethinking this, framing the approach for local engagement through community outreach and coalition building. And so at CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, our mission is to encourage production and preservation of housing in various ways, right? So I'm excited to be able to share a little bit about CHAPA and our mission and what the Municipal Engagement Initiative is, then also to talk about some of the communities that we've worked with and the successes thereof. So in terms of that, we look at it in terms of a three-pronged approach to CHAPA: advocating for opportunity, expanding access to housing, and developing the field. And so we know that community support can make or break housing development at the local level, but many communities lack a strong, affordable housing specific or pro-housing group. And so we're excited that we work with MHP to sort of get around that particular challenge in terms of community engagement. And the Municipal Engagement Program has started back in 2018 and sort of launches efforts from there. And so our goal in that program is to really build support for affordable housing production across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So sort of understanding that each community is unique. We are in several different types of communities. Those include ACTIN, Amherst, Arlington, Essex, Newton, Medford, Revere, Lynn, and also Foxborough. And so we also did a light touch approach in terms of launching our efforts in Agawam and Brookline. And so what we know to be true about each of those communities is that they're all unique, right? And they all require different approaches in terms of our coalition building model, in terms of our community engagement that we strive to do. And so I'll talk a little bit more later about what our MEI Light program entails, but I'll continue in terms of talking about our coalition building model. So the idea of the model is to really bring folks in the room, bring everyone in the room to talk about these particular issues, right? Municipal staff, elected officials, housing advocates, and developers, right? Local businesses, civic groups, houses of worship, environmentalist groups, service providers, residents, both renters and homeowners, right? Cultural groups, Black Lives Matter supporters, right? How do you get all of these folks in the room with their various interests, various levels of expertise? We see everyone as an expert. This is how we sort of frame this model, getting them all in the room, and then having them have a voice that then is more profound in terms of the community because it's more reflective of the community and the community's needs and desires. So this model also involves an activeness, right? In terms of that playbook, it's a constant asking a question of who is missing from the room and why. How do we get more folks involved? How do we get more folks engaged, right? We can talk about what folks' needs are as we see it, but how do we get them and empower them themselves to talk about those issues? So having a fair housing lens approach to thinking about who's missing from the table when you're doing this coalition model of housing advocates and pro-housing advocates on the local level. So who are the stakeholders, right? We oftentimes think of them in certain ways, and so we're kind of trying to demystify that and debunk it in terms of thinking about how renters are experts, renters are stakeholders in the community, right? How do you engage those even who would like to be in the community? Maybe they work in the community, but they can't afford to live there. How do you think about having those voices at the table, right? Thinking about who are the experts, right? People who rent themselves are experts, right? You can speak from a place of authenticity in terms of understanding what that means. So expanding a more collaborative approach to allies in terms of an equity lens, understanding that if your issue is schools, if it is climate change, if it is bikes, and how all of those things are interrelated to housing, how it's central really to housing in terms of where your children can go to school and what the parks look like and all of those different things in terms of access. So going beyond what the minimal threshold is to creating a welcoming environment, right? So how do you also think about communities who maybe want to have more diversity? So maybe that's their challenge as it's different. And how do you create a welcoming environment, right? In terms of who is missing, how do we get folks to want to be involved and see themselves as this is their group, right? You're setting the table for them. This is their table. It's not just setting the table for them in terms of coming to the space, but helping them to see the space as their own. So that's some of the work that we do in our group in terms of thinking about what those underrepresented voices are and how they have access, right? When do we have the meeting? Do we provide food? Do we provide childcare? Are there translation services available? Are we thinking about the digital divide, right? Folks who can't navigate those systems in terms of online space, but also those who don't have access to internet, right? How are we thinking about what we're doing to really, really be intentional about getting folks involved in this work? And so we have flexible models for each community, understanding that each community has a different form of government makeup, right? Rural communities are very different than the greater Boston areas in terms of their challenges and what they're looking for, the types of housing they're looking for, the character that they would like to see, the sense of diversity that they're challenged with in terms of including. And so their housing stock, all of those things are different. So we have a flexible model for each unique specific community. And so successes look very different. So sorry, I'm kind of running through my slides here because I want to really have time for our discussion for today and give time for Courtney to speak as well. So let me know if I'm going too fast. But our successes in our community are look in certain types of ways. So in one way, we see success as having a viable coalition, having a group that is meeting regularly, that has a mission, that has a vision, shared goals, that they are doing things like housing forums, and they're putting on informational sessions, and they're doing their great work. They're interacting with municipal officials and town government, and et cetera. But also we see successes and wins in terms of that playbook, right? We're seeing wins in terms of, does housing get built, right? Have they made any sort of change in terms of policy, inclusionary zoning? You know, many of our groups are sort of challenged with thinking about what that means in their particular community. So we see successes as well in terms of policy, as well as actual production. Is housing getting built? And also in other aspects in terms of what is their mission. If their mission is to have more inclusiveness or more diversity, right? You see those different things as when it's important as a group to really step back and calculate that, right? Reward yourself in a way, right? To say like, okay, we've accomplished this. It's important to step back to say, what have we accomplished here in terms of our mission and vision? So our local strategies include supporting efforts of each community to build a culture that welcomes housing and including affordable housing. So that's done in various ways in terms of education, visibility, et cetera. Bolstering efforts to expand housing opportunities in their communities, whether through policy or zoning, et cetera. Growing the number of people supporting housing production in each community, right? Thinking about that stakeholder lens of who is a stakeholder and who is missing from the table. And then having a shared and collective responsibility of stakeholders in terms of seeing their issues as everyone's issue. right? Seeing the issue outside of themselves and connected to their own social and economic well-being and the well-being of others. That's important in this work in terms of coming together. Because oftentimes what you want to sort of drive home and what your thing is not going to be upfront or number one at that particular time in terms of the group, but seeing the collective shared space in terms of the overall good. Using data to support what you know, right? So we're excited to be working with MHP with their use of the Data Town tool, which I encourage many of y'all to check out if you haven't already. But really, we use the data to support what communities already know about their community so that they can then have these conversations, right? It's nothing new. They know the demographics of their community. They're clear that housing hasn't been built. But how do you use that data that you can find from those tools to sort of share out and to create op-eds and put information out on social media and make comments at town meeting and have an exercise of myth busting in terms of housing in their community, what people think is true about housing that isn't necessarily true, that if more housing gets built, there'll be more traffic, right? How do you demystify that and debunk it and use the data to support that in terms of strategies that are fact-based, right? And so we are in several communities, one of which was ACTIN. So this will hopefully resonate for some in terms of this particular role discussion and how the challenges sometimes are different in the strategies in terms of what we do in different communities. So in ACTIN, we first came into ACTIN. It was one of our pilot programs in our MEI coalition. And so it was the first sort of launch of our efforts of coalition building, where they had been contacting MHP to say, we need help. We want to kind of get this work done, and we need your help to get it done. And so what was exciting about that was that MHP then worked with CHAPA to sort of start this program, right, to kind of help communities like these to get some of their work done. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of what they've been able to do, right? They put together these, as you see on the left, on the right rather, the infographic about their community so that they can begin to launch and have these particular conversations. They started a group, and as they named themselves Housing for All, ACTIN, Housing for All, which I love that name. They created a mission, a vision, and they started getting some really great work done, having monthly meetings, writing letters to the editor, email lists to supporters, to mobilize. They all committed themselves to say, we're going to bring 10 neighbors and friends to, to this work, and to create like this email blast so that when timely things come up, folks who agree with our mission and goals can show up and show out. And they were able to do some of those things very successfully. Housing forums on topical events and meetings in local congregation. They actually had their meeting in a local church. So I think that sort of does set the pace and the tone of the work that they were trying to do in terms of creating a space for housing for all, right? This idea that there's a sense of morale, the work that they were trying to do in their particular community. And so I'll talk a little bit later. I'll save this, one of their successes in terms of the articles that they were able to do in getting folks out around this particular issue. I was going to share it later. I guess I could share it now, but they have worked on a warrant housing guide where more people spoke out more forcefully. They were able to get 60 people at a meeting for a land disposition, right? And that was really groundbreaking. 60 people out who were in support. And what was happening was that wasn't the case in the past, where they were really challenged and almost just made it, but they were able to really turn the tables there, as you'll see on the right. All 3 articles were endorsed by the Housing for All, and then were passed at 89% support at town meeting, which was really, really pivotal in changing the tone and the conversation in ACTIN. We also are in Amherst, so I wanted to share a little bit about the example about the work that we have done in Amherst with monthly meetings, again, letters to the editor, relevant relevant meetings and representation at them, challenging themselves about thinking about inclusiveness and diversity around age, ethnicity, etc. But also they were able to do a buttons campaign, which was really exciting, right? So you'll see on the bottom this circle, it says, I support affordable housing. So when they show up to these to these meetings, etc., and public discussions, they had a sense of being together, right? As opposed to oftentimes you're feeling alone in this conversation with Courtney, I think we'll talk a little bit about later, in terms of sometimes you're the lone person talking in support of a particular project, but they were together and able also to pass out buttons for folks who were also in line with their mission. So that was really exciting. They used Facebook to talk about affordable housing opportunity in real time. So they utilized that as an effort to get the word out, assisting people. And they had a table at sort of community common market, right, to talk about affordable housing, to talk about the work and try to expand the conversation. They were in support of the 132 Northampton, which was a single room occupancy building, a studio apartment that they were looking to build, which had some huge NIMBY responses in terms of not wanting it. They were able to sort of turn the table on that, write letters in support of this particular affordable housing opportunity. Each Street School is another example, and I can talk a little bit more about that. I want to make sure to be cognizant of time as well. But they were really able to sort of turn the tables in terms of that. But we know that there are many challenges in terms of doing this coalition building work. What is the role of municipalities when they're part of this space, when advocacy groups say, we want this, and then they're challenged in terms of their work roles, right? So that's been a challenge. A momentum and fatigue. People get tired and weary sometimes in doing this work and not always seeing the wins, which is why it's important to step back and say, what have we accomplished, right? Growth versus reach, right? So there's these goals of where they want to go, and sort of challenge with that expectancy in terms of what they're able to do, right? Does the group start off as an invitation-based group, right, where you target who is part of this conversation? Is it open? Is there a large opposition, right? COVID-19 certainly created some huge challenges, right? This pandemic that we found ourselves in, where now meetings have to happen in virtual spaces. So how do you do these one-on-one outreach to get folks involved in the work when you can't meet with people one-on-one, where there's digital divide challenges in terms of people being able to be involved as well. Conflicting crises, right? People are concerned with Black Lives Matters and the health crisis and unemployment and the political climate. And how do you help them to see housing as central to those discussions as well? So certainly there are challenges. And then we have the rescinding of the affirmatively furthering fair housing. That certainly suburbs are challenged with in terms of how they are approaching their need to combat what some of the dialogue has been nationally. So where do you start? Where do you go from here? We have a housing toolkit, the Housing Coalition Toolkit specifically on the website, and I've shared the link. I'll share the link with you all. Where we help you to think about how you can identify a core, think about who your partners are, begin to have conversations, do a data dive, launch an event, think about what your process is, growth and action. And so we've mapped that out as we've utilized in Agawam and in Brookline to get them started with their particular work. And so the idea of opening doors to welcoming communities through policy, through coalition building and planning, is this idea that your zip code should not determine your future, right? There's things to consider: mortgage lending, zoning law, segregation, redlining, blockbusting, and predatory lending. All of these things, historical biases are sort of baked into the communities that we love. And so we should be intentional about how we undo those things as well, right? In terms of its overall impact, wealth creation, and how it's limited certain people of color to home ownership and wealth and opportunity, et cetera. So we have this idea that you can do these race and place dialogues to start the discussion about who can be involved in some of the this coalition work and how they see themselves. And so we've given some examples there, right? Re-examining local preference, thinking about who's part of those conversations, having those hard conversations, affordability versus affordability. Can people afford to live here? And then what does it mean when they live here? Do they feel safe, right? Can they afford in that way? And so what do we stand to lose if we do nothing, right? How do we lose the sense of character, shared goals, experiences? What do we stand to lose if we have no viable group that's really advocating for these things on the local level, right? What does it mean for, the silent in the suburbs who are suffering and challenged with certain things, and how do we, what do we stand to lose if we don't have these conversations? And so there's this larger context, of course, of racial equity in terms of pathways to transportation, schools, urban planning, and gateways to wealth. So I wanted to talk about that, and again, happy to answer any questions that people have. But we have this tool, right, on our webpage, which I'll provide the link for it, which tell us where you live, right, where you can fill out information about yourself and let us know where you live so we can connect you to neighbors who are also interested in getting this work done. So we're happy to help you and connect you in those ways. And so if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those. And I'm also glad to be able to hand it over to Courtney, who's going to talk more with you about some of those challenges in the work. So thank you.
Katie, do you want to do a round of questions now, or do you want to do it all at the end?
We haven't gotten a lot of questions, but if you want to open it up, people could maybe shoot you some questions.
Yeah, why don't we, invite people to go in, and I'll get started, and then we can, I won't be super long.
Yeah, and everyone should just, if you're thinking, how would this work in my town, or what's a particular issue, you can just send it over in the chat, and eventually our panelists will get to answering those.
Sounds good.
Perfect.
Let me share my screen. Well, as usual, I am so inspired every time I talk to Whitney, but particularly when we're talking about this topic. So I think Whitney has done a tremendous job just setting the foundation for why these conversations are so important. As Katie mentioned, my name is Courtney. I work at coUrbanize. And for those of you who aren't familiar with coUrbanize, we're a technology platform that is really focused on empowering more people to shape what their communities are today and what they're going to be down the line. And a part of that is to be able to give them more ways to share that feedback, to ask questions, to have a voice in the process. So we really focus on being able to do that online, by text, by voicemail, and also to really do it in whatever languages make sense for that community. We were founded by a planner outside from MIT, and that is really grounds the work that we do. It is about the health of the community. So far we've worked with about 400 different project teams. We work with municipalities, we work with CDCs, RPAs, we also work with individual developers. And it's really about building trust with the community to activate them to support really making their community a better, more sustainable place to live. So today I wanted to walk through some of the findings that, as we were thinking about this topic, that really kind of came to the surface for me about projects related to affordable housing and the actions that we see that are really successful in overcoming those challenges. But first I wanted to start with some data points that we found through a survey that we did of consumers earlier this spring, pre-pandemic. So this data may look a little bit different today if we asked it, but I think there is always this thing of, is affordability really an issue? Is it only an issue in some markets? And Of all the people we surveyed, less than 30% agreed that their community was affordable to live in, and that was regardless of if it was an urban community, suburban, rural. It's a challenge everywhere. If this data was consistent dependent upon the state that people lived in, it is just an issue we face in this country. And that's probably part of the reason why over half of the people we surveyed said that they think affordable housing actually makes real estate development more attractive. Now, they say that, and then when it gets time to getting affordable housing approved, they may have different opinions, but we'll get there in a minute. So this is more of a breakdown of what that data looks like. So as you can see, there is a fluctuation between the three different categories of how we had people self-identify about the community that they live in. So yes, people in rural feel a little bit better about affordability, but it's still an issue. So that's something to consider, that I think it is, you know, something that you can gloss over a little bit, but still very much something that's impacting these communities. I also wanted to dive into this a little bit more because we had asked, you know, what makes a particular development more attractive for your community? Because I think there overall is, you know, a fear of development. And these were the responses of the data overall. So it really highlights the importance of community benefits, and one of those community benefits is affordable housing. So this is something that we're seeing more developers understand, to think about affordability, how they can be advocates for that, especially if they're, you know, what we call little d developers. They live and they work within the communities where they're building. And it's something that we're seeing more people want to get into, especially now that, you know, I think the future of the office space developer will rebound, but right now there is an opportunity for them to have some impact on affordable housing as well. So our first kind of big finding is most people just don't understand what affordable housing is. And I bet a lot of you live and breathe this every day. They just don't know what it means, the varieties of affordable housing, what zoning for affordable housing means versus individual developments. And also, what are the benefits of it? And I think there is a lot of fear mongering that happens with affordable housing, especially right now on the national level. So it's really important to start by just educating the community about what it is and sticking with the facts and not assuming that people understand what affordable housing is, as well as, you know, the people who live and breathe it, you all really know what it is. So the data from BU shows that, you know, these misconceptions and, you know, the lack of truth really do impact the ability to make change around affordable housing a reality. So the team at BU looked at public meetings in Massachusetts related to proposed housing developments, not necessarily affordable, but just housing. And most people who stood up at those public meetings, as you probably aren't surprised by, were not in support of those development projects. And it's really unfortunate because, you know, the voice of a few really impacts the well-being and the future of the community for everybody. So it's just something to be cognizant of in terms of, you know, who is having a voice in the process. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is the work that the Westboro Affordable Housing Trust is doing in partnership with MHP, because I think they're doing a really tremendous job in doing this, you know, hard work around education. So I'm actually going to pull up their page on coUrbanize. I mean, you can do this on any kind of website you want, but I wanted to show the type of information that they're sharing because I think it's really interesting. So, you know, this is the landing page that you arrive at. And I think a few things to call out are it's available to be translated into multiple languages. So that's really important as you think about, you know, who are you educating within the community, and it's not just native English speakers. And they also do a tremendous job putting educational materials front and center. So they define what an affordable housing trust is. Most people probably don't know what that is at first glance. They link to so many resources, and it just feels really well done. It feels like it gives you a sense of confidence in what they're doing, that this is a known thing, the people who are behind this are experts in it, and if you want, you can go and find out more about these things. They also do a really great job to what Whitney was saying around using data. So they really dig in and showcase what affordable housing and housing affordability means in Westboro. It's not, you know, what it means in Massachusetts, it's what it means in that specific community. So there's a link to this in the deck, and I can grab it and put it in the chat as well. But they have so much data about homeowners versus renters, and Westboro, if I scroll down, sorry if I'm making everyone a little dizzy, Westboro in comparison to similar communities and how that looks. So they really focus on giving people kind of a, you know, a state of the union of how Westboro compares to other communities in relation to this. And it paints a really strong picture for why it's so important. They also have detailed full FAQs about, you know, the basics of housing affordability and the varieties of affordable housing. So if you are a community member who actually is just not, how do I say this politely, just angry about affordable housing and you want to find out more information, they give you all the opportunities in one place to get that education if you're uncertain about it. And that really is, you know, a one-way communication vehicle. That's them talking, you know, putting their information out there to the community. But I think what they've also done really well is, if I just scroll down, they are really having a two-way dialogue with the community as it relates to, you know, questions people are having about affordable housing. So this is, you know, one specific example of a community member asking, you know, what is affordable housing when it comes to renters and when it comes to homeowners? And this kind of one-to-one interaction, I think, is another example of, you know, building confidence with a community member, but also, you know, leaning in on this, you know, desire to educate people. Because again, this is a conversation that other community members can view and see. It's very much set up for that. So the team is just doing a really great job with this, you know, first fundamental premise of just educating people about what affordable housing is. The next is, you know, this realization that opposition to housing is really representative of usually only a small fraction, even if they seem really loud. And this is about how do you activate people in the community that you typically don't hear from. And to Whitney's point, I think we're at a really interesting point in being able to do things differently, because before it was community meetings, we all know what that's like. And now, you know, there's Zoom, there's other things that people are doing to activate voices. So I think it is a real opportunity to reflect about how you're doing that work. Again, a stat that I think is really important from BU is that, you know, most people who do show up to public meetings tend to be white. They tend to be pretty affluent in comparison to their fellow community members. They're older and they're more likely to be homeowners. So with that in mind, if you're just listening to the voices, even on you know, a virtual public meeting, I think there is a grain of salt for who is talking and who is getting the time and the attention about their opinions. And it's important to think about, you know, who aren't you hearing from? And Whitney did a good job of starting to outline these as well. But, you know, usually you're not hearing from renters, you're not hearing from community members who may be newer, they may have recently moved, or they may also be, you know, wanting to move into these communities. Perhaps they work there, but they don't live there. Parents right now, God bless them if they're on a community meeting at night right now, after homeschooling and doing whatever else that parents have to struggle with right now. People who work, you know, night jobs, people who work second shift, people who work 2 jobs, people who just may not be able to, you know, show up to a public meeting. Non-native English speakers, people who actually are eligible and can benefit from affordable housing, seniors. I wonder about the millennial thing just because of Zoom, but I think we don't have data on that yet. So I'm okay still saying that right now you don't hear from a ton of millennials at a typical community meeting. So how do you, you know, really think about empowering these different types of people? And we really recommend a blend of activities to give people options and to address what Whitney has positioned as the digital divide. So meetings are important, but I think we have to recognize that when meetings are happening virtually, which it feels like in our state for the foreseeable future, they'll likely be virtual. Who has the access and the ability to show up at those meetings? So you may not hear from people who have only one computer and they're trying to let their kids do their schoolwork. There are people who are just not technologically savvy, even in this day and age, to feel comfortable doing Zoom. There are people who don't have internet access. Like, there's so many different things that can prevent people from interacting online in terms of needing an internet connection. So, boots on the ground work, trying to, see people where they're at, even if it's, going to a park and doing some community conversations at a safe distance. Something else that we're seeing more of are people wanting to gather feedback via text message, because most people, even if you have a basic phone, can do texting. So that's been a really popular one that we're seeing more of. And also voicemail. So, going back to the very basics, people can call a phone number, leave a voicemail, and their voices are heard. So this is two different examples of kind of these ways of activating the community in action. So on the left-hand side is a sign from a community wanting to understand, what types of housing does this community really need? Text in your answer. It makes it really easy. It's in the moment. You can just do it while you're, walking your dog. And then on the right is an example of a comment we received via voicemail. And what I really like about this one is you can kind of hear a person saying this, and it's not, someone who had to take a lot of time to think about what to write online. So these are two different types of communication vehicles that we're seeing more people do more often right now. And then the last is something that, ever since the murder of George Floyd, we've been particularly conscious of at coUrbanize. So we realize, especially on our projects related to affordable housing, there's a lot of implicit or unconscious bias in people's comments, especially those who are uneducated about what affordable housing is, and in particular, the impacts that it can have on the community. The typical comments about crime, property value, traffic, school system pressures. Like, there is a bias that's often associated with those things. And, I think previously people could have, just dismissed those and said, people can, figure out that those are just miseducated folks. But I don't think we have the luxury of standing back and assuming that anymore. So I think a big change, and something that is perhaps a little uncomfortable, is to address those biases head on when you see them. So I pulled a few examples from coUrbanize about how we do this. So on the left is a comment that we got about an affordable housing project. Get rid of the undesirables, the people who are lazy, the people who are criminal, the people who aren't making this particular development a great place to live. So I think, one of the things that we do when we get these is we actually have a team of people who looks at them, and we say, how can we respond in a way that's not just, deleting the comment or hiding the comment? Because, we really try to have a mission of not interfering with the community's feedback, unless it's openly discriminatory, racist, violent, etc. But on the right-hand side is how we responded. So we said, right now your comment has been flagged, and we want to share resources with you about what affordable housing really is and the positive benefits that it brings to the community. So it does take a little bit more time to stop, think about, how can you create a response? I would say the best thing is to have resources at the ready. I can share some of the ones that we use to educate people. But I think the first step is, using these as, teachable moments, even if perhaps somebody doesn't want to be taught, just to really think that they do. Here's another one from Westboro. So this one is related to property values, which we see a lot of in taxes. So, I think that's something that you could read into as potential bias. But the other thing I wanted to flag on this top comment is attracting young families. If you really lean into that, why does it have to be young families? Why can't it be an older family? I think maybe that's being a little bit critical, but it's something to think about. And I think the team in Westboro did a really good job of answering this question and saying, very strongly, affordable housing does not lower property values. Here are the benefits of it, and you can read more here. And I think, they, didn't, sugarcoat it. They tried to be really specific with them and really trying to answer this from a place of, I'm going to correct you, even though I'm going to do it nicely. And I'm going to help you understand this because, this person is a valued community member. They did take the time to ask this question and to give their feedback. So we should take the time to respond to them. So, just in quick summary, I would say, 3 things to think about are, really focusing on educating people, whether that's, just one way and you're sharing resources and you're telling your story with facts, but also, don't be afraid to have a two-way dialogue, whether that's online, whether that's in person, and to really lean into the fact that you can do a really great benefit for whether it's a zoning change initiative or a particular affordable housing development by taking the time to educate people. Then, think about how you can empower more people to be a part of the conversation. There are some people right now who have a little bit of time on their hands because they're not going out and doing fun things. So maybe it's, even just thinking about, how can we get younger community members involved? And I don't think you can necessarily cut off, 10 of those different chunks of unheard voices at once and say, we're going to activate all of these people, but thinking about what can you do perhaps to activate one particular population is important. One of our clients in San Francisco is it's right outside of San Francisco, but they're doing the redevelopment of public housing. And one of their challenges is that they have a really large Samoan population, and they have a specific strategy to engage and build a coalition to have a representative audience from that population. So they talk to the Samoan civic group. They are thinking about ways to make sure that they're using the leaders of that group to disseminate information and to make sure that they know when there are opportunities to share their concerns, to share their voices in the process. And then the last, I think, is, really leaning in on the facts. I think it's really right now hard if you really believe in affordable housing and you're doing the work to change communities, to see, the leader of our country say that, it's the death of the suburbs. And it's exhausting, and you want to sometimes, I think, react with passion. But I think, it's best to think about what facts can you provide specific to that community about affordability, and to really make it laser focused. And it's a little exhausting, so I recognize that, and I want to honor everyone's contributions to that, but I think that can help just really make the conversations less of a burden on the people who have to have them. So that's it for me. I mean, I'm happy to answer questions about if there are specific questions about coUrbanize or strategies that we've seen work really well. If you have specific incidences that you want to talk through, happy to do that.
This is Katie Lacey. We've received some very interesting comments in the chat.
Nice.
And one I did want to bring forward was, there was a recent question about if the concern is increasing numbers of school children and costs associated with that, respectful ways to address that. And one thing I just wanted to tag onto that community, I know there's data we can use, but also how to tactfully remind people that, their children probably went through the public schools, as did they.
Yeah.
And that, sharing our resources is sort of one of our obligations as a community. So I didn't know if you had any tips on that.
Yeah, one of the comments that I was thinking about putting in the deck, but I didn't end up, was a comment about the school system. So it was saying, is this going to be a burden on school? And I think, you can switch out school for whatever public entity you want, whether that's, one of the comments we got today was about the water impact, like we're going to use up too much water. So it can be anything, but I think an example that I found that was really good was that somebody responded by saying, we've already talked with the public school system. We've talked with the superintendent. They feel comfortable with this. We're good. and to not only with the facts, but saying, you know, we've talked to the person in charge of this in our system and they think we're okay. And to also, I think to your point, Katie, saying, you know, a part of this is creating a community that's sustainable for everybody. And that means sustainable for the children of this community. And that means we need to be welcoming of more children. So it's a hard one, because I know Whitney and I have talked about an example where somebody had said, you know, I think it was in North Adams, Whitney, the one about
Yes.
someone's son at a public meeting.
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you brought that up, Courtney, because that example of a public meeting in North Adams where a mother was talking about, you know, questioning whether or not she felt welcome in this community based off the comments that people were making. I think there was a comment in the chat about this sort of code speak, right? Code language of you know, that makes people feel unwelcome. And she sort of called that out at the meeting. And the response from the crowd was really nasty, actually, in terms of saying to her, you know, well, yeah, leave. We don't want you here, right? I mean, just there were racist comments. There was comments around her child who had a disability. And so these sort of things that we see, these examples really are sort of what catapulted our technical assistance group, and I see some of the members of that group here on the call today, of course. We really started to think about a public discourse framework, right? How can we give tools to not just community members, but also folks who are on zoning appeals boards, you know, zoning boards and municipal staff, so that they know how to respond, right, when they hear these type of comments, right? Comments that are, you know, discriminatory, comments that are, you know, make communities seem exclusive, right? These type of things. Knowing how to respond before those things come up is what's best. So we were thinking about how do we put together a tool and a framework so that folks know how to respond both as residents when speaking up response to comments, but also officials who are in those particular roles, knowing how to call out, right? We're not going to take comments that are discriminatory as we make our determinations on this particular request, right? Having that line, making it clear so that it then helps communities feel like, unlike that mother in North Adams who then said, well, maybe I will move out of here. Maybe I don't feel welcome here. Rather, she would feel supported after a comment would be made like that, right? So how do we set ourselves up to be able to have responses when we hear things like, we don't want more children in our community, right? And calling that out as a fair housing violation. We don't want those people, or like the example that Courtney alluded to in her presentation where, you know, trashy criminals, those types of, how do you have language beforehand to be able to respond to those things? And then, as Katie mentioned, having the data to sort of debunk that, you know, as well. So I think those things are important. And those examples are clear reasons why we want to sort of create this public discourse sort of framework to be able to have that's useful for folks to know what is appropriate, right? They don't know that fine line between like having people are able to have open comments, but also how do you set a framework before a meeting starts that you're not going to accept that type of behavior, right? So I think that's important as well.
I think on a related note, there was another question that I think probably a lot of us are grappling with right now, not just in the housing sphere, but in many, which is any tips on talking to people who are really dug in with a NIMBY approach and, you know, will just say, I do not want, you know, I don't want, do you recommend engaging? Do you recommend, what you got?
Yes. So I think that, you know, you talked a little bit about people who sort of dig down, right? There's going to be some that you're not going to sway, right? You know, you really want to make sure that when you're having those type of dialogues, those discussions, that you pivot back to the main point, right? You know, there certainly are some folks that are amenable and open, but there really are other folks who just don't want the project at all. It's just, you're not going to convince them with your data. You're not going to convince them with your inclusive language or your forward thinking. I would say, you know, similar to what coUrbanize is able to do, right? They were able to show and debunk with facts, right? Go back to the facts, as opposed to sort of arguing with a person. I think that, you know, as opposed to pulling the comment, right? They were able to respond to it. And I think that that sets a tone as well in terms of the process being transparent, being accessible, being inclusive as well. I think that, you know, there's oftentimes challenges in terms of that with these sort of discussions. But, you know, I guess I would say use your best discretion, right, when having that. But also it helps when you have others like you who are telling us a similar contrary story, as opposed to folks who are sort of digging down in their NIMBYism in that moment. Courtney, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, we get this question a lot with new customers, and it's always, no, well, do you prevent them from going on the platform? No.
Right.
I think, you know, they deserve to be heard. If they, you know, create 20 accounts and are just spamming people, then that's a problem. But, you know, I think for us, it's really about, you know, recognizing that they may be loud, they may perhaps be viewed as unreasonable, but at least give them an opportunity to be heard, whether that's, you know, one conversation, having the ability to invite them to participate in the dialogue. But it's never going to be 100% positive for any project. I mean, I think the best thing you can do is think about, you know, how can you in some ways negate those voices with, you know, a volume of other people in support of the project. But I mean, there in some ways, I agree with you, Katie, like there's just some people you're not going to change their minds. So the best you can do is allow them to feel heard.
If you guys, there's been another question that I think would be interesting to hear from Courtney. One, someone commented, would you think about not calling it coUrbanize? Because I think, and I think this is true, I think for the rural communities that are the audience of this, that even, they're like, we're not urban. And I think on a related note, I think a question, the logistics of how could a rural community engage something like coUrbanize? Is it a question of, does the municipality engage them? And, you know, who is getting this input that you're getting? So just a little bit about how it works.
Yeah. We have gotten the comment about urbanize being a bad word many times. And this year we actually introduced the ability for people who do want to be on coUrbanize, but they don't want coUrbanize to be front and center in the URL, but they can change that URL to be something they want it to be, whether that's,
Okay.
You know, westboroughaffordablehousingtrust.com, for example. Like that's an option if people want to explore it. And then I think you get rid of if there is a stigma related to that. But we engage with people in a couple of different ways. So we do have many municipal clients who will bring us on in advance of a zoning change they want to make. If there is a housing authority who's doing either redevelopment work or new development work, they'll engage with us. We've worked with regional planning authorities to also think about, you know, what is a particular project related to a comprehensive plan as it relates to housing. So there are a lot of different points of engagement, and we try to be as flexible as possible just to really relate to what people need. And I would say, you know, something to also think about is, you know, when you do have a project that's being built, you know, really encouraging the developer to have, you know, a continuing discourse with the community, to not have it stop once a zoning change is made. Because people will fight individual projects. I mean, that's what's closest to them if they're in a particular community. But yeah, we do work with rural communities who are really focused on kind of expanding their reach. So, you know, understanding that there may be, you know, the same 15 people at every community meeting, but wanting to think about, you know, others who they can invite into the conversation, who don't, you know, necessarily have the transportation to go to a meeting, who don't have the access to go to a meeting. So it's the same goal, even if it's a rural community. Oftentimes the projects just look a little bit different. So we've worked with some communities on, a community of single family housing development for affordable housing. We've worked with some on inclusionary zoning. We're working with the team behind Fort Devens ahead of a super town meeting. So it's several towns that are going to come together and vote on the future of that. So, and the big part of that is to add housing there. So that's another way that people will choose to engage with coUrbanize in a town municipality structure, which is ahead of a town meeting. What information can we disseminate about a particular zoning change, a project, etc., in order to facilitate a really smooth town meeting once people are there for the vote?
Okay, well, I think we got through most of the questions. There was one from our own Russ about, what about communities? And I deal with this all the time with inclusionary zoning. Do you engage in the conversation about not just getting to the 10% in terms of the subsidized housing inventory? And this may be less of an issue in more rural towns where there's not a lot of development pressure. But if either you or Whitney have been faced with this question, sort of how do you get around that?
Whitney, is that something that CHAPA has faced?
Yeah, and I mean, again, as Katie mentioned, each community is unique. What we try to model in our coalition work, I mean, and we're very intentional in working with MHP to kind of create this program, the Municipal Engagement Initiative, right? The idea that this coalition that starts is having conversations with on the municipal level, right? They're having conversations with developers, right? Some of our groups are, able to leverage their stakeholder group to say, hey, we'd like to sit down with the developer and talk about, some different aspects of the project and what we'd like to see more of, right? It doesn't hurt, but having in those relationships and having that dialogue outside of the public meeting space is often helpful in that, right? In terms of you're wanting more, right? You're thinking about how particular projects will benefit your community specifically, right? So we encourage on the case by case, depending on the project, to really be thinking about those things and to challenge and to ask for more, right? Oftentimes our coalition groups are in a position where they're asking to see more. You mentioned, Katie, inclusionary zoning. Some of our communities may or may not have inclusionary zoning, so they're examining that. What would that look like in their community, so that that's a baseline to what they can expect in particular projects. And so I think that that's essential. The other sort of best practice we find in this work is sort of not recreating the wheel, right? How can we learn from what other groups have done to be able to re-implement that, right? How did they do that over there? How did they get more than 10%? How did they do that? How did they advocate for that in that community, right? And so we see our role in connecting folks with where there have been other successes so that they can have some one-on-one best peer-to-peer learning, right? So they can figure out what has worked and what they can implement in terms of strategy. Are making the case calls that we have put together as a result of having Dr. Tiffany Manuel come out and do a session. It was in person, which is unheard of at this time, right? We had an in-person sort of 2-day aggressive workshop with her, where she talked about how to make the case for affordable housing in light of all the many crises that we oftentimes are dually thinking about, right? And so from that, we sort of continue those conversations and are making the case calls. And during these calls, Zoom meetings, what have you, we talk through and troubleshoot those particular issues. So a community might say, hey, we want more than 10%. How do we get this done, right? And so we have a group of housing advocates that will throw ideas at the wall and start to brainstorm, and we'll share best practices and thinking particularly about moments or challenges that we're dealing with. So invite you, if you're interested, to reach out to us if you're interested in being part of that space and those conversations that we have monthly. So that's certainly a thing that I would add to that. Side of just the meeting, developing those relationships, thinking about how you can get it done, I think is what happens to be essential in those things that get folks over those curves.
Something that I wanted to flag that I don't know how many comments we've gotten on coUrbanize about, but something that's happening in my own community. I live in Salem, Massachusetts, so not Western Mass, but inclusionary zoning has failed twice in a year in Salem. And part of the dialogue is that, is the requirement around affordable housing units and new development enough? So we're kind of seeing the opposite. And we've seen this a little bit in other states as well, that people are saying this isn't enough. And because it's not enough, I'm going to vote no. And that's its own problem. I don't know how much that's being experienced right now in Western Mass, but just something to flag that that's now another conversation that people are starting to have.
We did have one more question, and these are really tough issues, I think, around actual dollars and cents. Someone was asking, you know, if a student costs $11,000 a year to educate and a renter household doesn't generate that amount of taxes, how can you justify more housing? And I think Whitney gave me some good ideas. We get this a lot too, about, you know, maybe starting the conversation off with, what kind of community do you want? I mean, do you want children in your community, or do you want like a community with no children? Do you want people who maybe go through a divorce or a hard patch, people to stay there and rent a home, or do you not? So, you know, appealing to people's greater good is not necessarily off limits. It's being done tactfully.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Katie. I think that you have to kind of start from a place, what do we agree on, right? What do we agree we want to see? And what are the ways that that happens? And often in these conversations, there's a bit of give and take, right? You might have more traffic, but that might mean that folks can get housed in your community at a particular income bracket, right? You might just have to, like, it might just be an extra 2 minutes on the way home. And like, are you willing to give that? Is that worth that for you? And challenging those conversations. Thank you, Chris, for your comment, right? The value-based messaging, right? It's important. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about, you know, these things over not, in terms of we want diversity in our community? Well, that sometimes will mean more families, young families, and families with children who will grow up and then have children. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, what are we talking about here? But I think, like you talked, what was important, you noted, Katie, was the tactfulness, right? Tact and timing. I'm often telling my husband, tact and timing. Talk to me. I'm happy to do the dishes, but tact and timing, right? You're willing to do certain things, but it's about, how do you have those conversations and timing? Where are you having them, and how, and how are they able to lean in despite having to give something up? Yeah. Other questions that you noted, Katie, Boston, that we haven't gotten to?
Well, there was a great response to that last question, which is that the building that the renters are in may actually be generating more taxes. So there's a nuts and bolts question. I think we're pretty much at the end. And I don't know, Katie B, if you had another question you wanted to ask, or last chance for people to throw something in.
No, I just wanted to make sure Whitney got in about the making the case work, which she mentioned before, the working group. I think that's a really great resource for many communities. And like she said, the key is not to reinvent the wheel, and to be in communication with other communities and understand what they're doing and how you can make that happen in your community. So with that, I want to thank Courtney and Whitney so much for joining us, and for everyone for attending and asking great questions. We really had a good conversation today. Like I said in the beginning, this will be recorded, so we'll post this to the Housing Toolbox website. And we hope you can join us next week. We will be, it'll be facilitated by Isabel Cruz, who's also an MHP colleague. She's on the One Mortgage team and works in our homeownership policy work. She'll be joined by Brendan Bailey, who is part of the Realtor Association of Pioneer Valley. They'll be looking at real estate market trends in the region and opportunities and challenges home buyers are facing right now, and hopefully provide some resources and also learn from the attendees what's happening. So you can visit the mhp.net /community/events, and you'll be able to have more information there and link to sign up via Zoom. So with that, thank you so much and have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.